So next I will talk about my work, smartphone background activities in the wild, origin, energy drain, and optimization. So as you all know, we can hardly live without our smartphones, but the limited battery life is still a big problem. A recent study shows that 89% of the users think that the battery life is the most important feature when they buy a new phone. But users are still anxious that their phone may die in the next moment. For example, another recent study monitored 30,000 Android users shows that in 43% of days, users will charge their phone more than once a day. So you may ask where the energy of the battery goes in your phone. So to answer this question, we conduct the energy measurement study on 2,000 Galaxy S3 or S phone users in the wild, lasting about 1 month. So we log some energy-related data using a free Android app, which you can download from Google Play. And we calculate the energy consumption using a hybrid power model, which we introduced in our previous paper. So this power model can pretty much capture most of the main components of the phone. For example, the CPU, GPU, screen, which we use utilization-based power model, or the network cards, which we use a finite state machine-based power model. And we also capture the power of some maintenance components like the Wi-Fi beacon, Wi-Fi scanning, cellular paging, or SoC suspension. So here, we just consider that it will consume a constant value of power when those components are switched on. So based on the result of our study, we found out that 46% of the daily energy is spent during screen off when the users don't directly interact with their phones. And within this screen off energy, the maintenance energy is 17%, and the rest 29% is spent due to some background activities of the apps during screen off. So in this paper, we focus on optimizing this part of energy to increase the energy efficiency of your phones. So you may ask, what are those screen-off activities? They can be some prefetched updates, for example, to prefetch the current weather or the daily news, so the delay will be minimized when the users check those information in foreground. They can also be some for generating some runtime notifications, like a new message from your WhatsApp friends, or a message like it's your turn to play from a game app. It can also be serving as some non-touch-based user interactions, like listening to the music or syncing your local files to the Dropbox server. But for particular users, some of the activities are useful, but some are not, which will secretly drain your phone's battery in background without your knowledge. So to disable those useless activities, there are some existing methods. For example, in iOS, it provides a feature called Disable Background App Refresh. So if users switch it on, then all the background activities will be disabled. And Android has a similar feature called Restrict Background Data. But this kind of method is so blanket that it can also disable some useful background activities to affect the user experience. And in iOS and Android, users can also manually go to the system settings to individually disable the app's background activity for each app, or go to some in-app settings to mute the notifications. But this way is too cumbersome for users to use, since they need to individually turn on or turn off the notification for each app you installed, which can be like 40 or 60 on your phones. So in this paper, our goal is to automatically suppress the background activities during screen off, which are only not useful for users. So a key hypothesis behind our solution is that the usefulness of app screen off activities is app-dependent and user-dependent. So this hypothesis is pretty intuitive. For example, for app dependent, I may need my Gmail notifications whenever a new email comes to my phone, but I don't want any background sync of my app, my game apps. And for user dependent, for example, you may want to see your Facebook's newsfeed every time when they come, but I may not want to bother about that. And this hypothesis is also validated by our real-world data, which I will introduce later. So the rest of my talk will basically answer two questions. The first is how to quantify the usefulness, where we will validate our hypothesis. And the second question is how to develop an online algorithm to optimize the screen-off activities. So first question, to quantify the usefulness, we use a background-foreground correlation metric. We call it BFC. So to calculate the overall BFC, we first define a per interval BFC for each screen-off interval where an app will run some background activity in background. So by interval, I mean the interleaved screen-on and screen-off intervals as shown in this figure. So basically, to calculate the per interval BFC, there are only two cases. In the first case, like B1, where the next screen-on interval has some foreground activities happen, then the BFC of B1 will be 1. And in the opposite case of B2, where the next screen-on interval has no foreground activity, then the BFC of B2 will be 0. And the overall BFC is simply an average of all the per interval BFCs. So if the overall BFC is close to 0, which means the foreground and background has little correlation, we can say most of the background activities are useless. And if the overall BFC is close to 1, which means whenever a background activity of an app happens, there will be another foreground activity happen in the next screen-on interval with a high correlation. So we say the background activities are useful. So we applying this BFC metric on our 2,000 user traces, and we see some property of the usefulness, which is the BFC property. For example, in the figure on the left, we can see this is the BFC value of 9 different users with a different amount of daily usage. So x-axis is all the apps of this user, and y-axis is the BFC value in increasing order. We can see for each user, which shown in each curve, the BFC of different apps are different, which means BFC is pretty app-dependent for each user. And in addition, for about 60% of the apps, the BFC have a 0 BFC value, which means there is a huge amount of room for us to suppress those useless activities so that the phone's energy consumption can be reduced. So the figure on the right shows the BFC value of 5 popular Android apps. And the x-axis is the normalized position of all the users using this app. And y-axis is the BFC value in increasing order. So we can see for each app, the BFC of different users vary a lot, indicating that BFC is also user-dependent. So now we use our BFC metric to validate that the usefulness of app background activities is app-dependent and user-dependent. Then we answer the second question. We develop a prediction-based online algorithm. Basically, this algorithm will keep track of per app BFC for each user using an exponential moving average shown in this equation. And it will suppress the background activities for within an interval when the BFC of this interval is less or equal to threshold factor alpha. And we also want to evaluate this algorithm. To evaluate this, we introduce two metrics. The first is obvious one, the energy saving equal to the total saved energy divided by the total energy without the suppression. And since our algorithm uses the history to predict the future, so some misprediction may happen. We use staleness compared to no suppression case to measure this prediction. So what is staleness? Staleness is usually defined as the elapsed time from the last background or foreground activities to the current foreground activity. For example, for this foreground activities, the arrow pointed, if nothing is suppressed, then the staleness will be this much. If the last background activity is suppressed, then the staleness will increase a little bit. If all the background activities are suppressed, then the staleness will be this much. Oh, by the way, even without any suppression, the staleness will still exist in our real world. So we use these two metrics to evaluate our algorithm using a trace-driven based simulation. So these two figures shows the result. The figure on the left shows the average energy saving for each 2,000 users. We can see the average energy saving when alpha is 0.1 is 16.4%. Consider that the upper bound is 29%. And the figure on the right shows the average staleness of each app over all the time for each user. We can say the staleness increase when alpha is 0.1 is 2.5 times compared to the no suppression case. So we want to ask ourselves, can we do better? Which means, can we improve the staleness and still maintain the energy saving? So to answer this question, we zoom into one particular user with high average staleness increase. We can see in this user's phone, only 4 apps out of 26 have high staleness increase. And we further analyze those 4 apps by drawing a timeline figure of the foreground and background activities. For example, the Google Now app. We can see in this app, there are so many background activities happen, which is in the blue dots, in between the foreground activity, which have very fewer amount. So all the other 3 apps also have the same behavior, and we abstract those activities in this figure. So according to the rule of our algorithm, if the BFC of current interval is less than alpha, then we will suppress all the following background activities until a foreground activity happens. So now the staleness will be this much. So we here, to refine this algorithm, we relax the strictness of suppression using an exponential backoff. So here, we maintain a threshold time tau. So this algorithm will allow some of the background activities happen after tau minutes since the last allowed background activity. And whenever a background activity is allowed, the tau will be increased, multiplied by a factor sigma, and so on and so far. So whenever a foreground activity happens, tau will be reset to an initial value. So now the staleness, based on our definition, will be only this much, significantly reduced compared to the original algorithm, and with just a small portion of background activity allowed here. So we re-evaluate our algorithm using the same 2 metrics. So we can see for the same user, for the 4 apps with high staleness increase, the staleness are improved successfully, and on average, the staleness increase drops from 2.5 times to 1.3 times. And the average energy saving drops just a little bit from 16.4% to 15.7%. So next, we implement this algorithm on Android Galaxy S3 phone running Android Jelly Bean. We call it Harsh. So in this implementation, it basically based on a key observation that in background, the apps will be invoked by some framework modules or framework services. So here, by doing this, we just intercept those framework services so that before the framework services try to invoke those apps, we like them to first check with our hash central component to see if the current app are allowed to run background jobs, or we need to suppress it. And by the way, the central hash components basically maintain the threshold time for each app, and also will be updated whenever foreground or background activity happens. So we also evaluate this hash implementation on 2 phones used by 2 normal users, and we will run the original Android for 3 days and run hash in another 3 days. So the table shows a basic result. If you focus on the bottom part of the table, we can see the average screen off power drops largely for 3 times and 5 times for these 2 users. And because of the slightly increase of the screen on power, the overall average power drops by 1.3 times and 1.4 times for both of these 2 users. So to conclude, in this paper, we first conduct an energy measurement study in the wild, showing that 29% of daily energy consumption is due to the background activities, which motivates our screen off energy optimization. Then we quantify this usefulness using a background-foreground correlation metric. And we use this metric to validate that usefulness is app-dependent and user-dependent. Then finally, we develop a screen off energy optimizer hash, which will save 15.7% of the daily energy on average, and you can also download it from GitHub following this link. So this is my talk. Thank you for listening. Okay.